Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Ashley Williams, and I'm the Vice President of Programs at Jumpstart. Thank you for joining us for this webinar recording of Off Mute and Amplified. Today, we're engaging in an intergenerational conversation with members of the Worthy Wage Campaign and members of the Ethos team to highlight their perspectives and resources on ECE history and activism. And so we'll be doing this webinar in the form of an intergenerational dialogue, including myself and a few other members, to really highlight how important it is as a tool for us to engage in dialogue across generations in ECE, to understand our history, to understand our current challenges, and to imagine anew and where we can be and the beauty of the dialogue that comes from it. So we're excited to kick that off and want to invite you also to join us for a live Q&A that we'll be hosting on Thursday, June 8th at 4 p.m. Pacific, at 7 p.m. Eastern. We invite educators, we invite systems leaders, come with your questions, engage with members of the Worthy Wage movement, myself, and Anna, who's also on the webinar with us today, and we look forward to seeing you live and in person then. But in the meanwhile, I'll go ahead and get us started so you can understand who's joining us today. So first, I'll introduce Anna Wald-Johannes. Anna is joining us. She's a program manager for ECESF, which is Early Care Educators in San Francisco, and she also supports the California Mentor Program. Anna herself is also an educator and has worked in ECE, and we are excited to have her and her perspective here with us today. We also have Peggy Haack, Rosemarie, Vardell. They are members of the Worthy Wage movement and the Ethos team joining us today. And as well, last but not least, Marcy Whitebook, who's the Director Emerita of the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment, at UC Berkeley, joining us today. So I invite you all to join me on screen and let's kick off this discussion. So to get us started, I want to acknowledge where we're starting at. We have an ECE system. We don't have a lot of time to dig fully in, but we know that we have an ECE system that has yet to serve children, families, and our educators well. And, due to the way that the system is organized and funded, it renders some of the enduring inequities that we see in ECE. And it's also important to uplift and understand that there are stories of resistance and activism to change the system that we have and work toward the system that we would like to see. And so Peggy, Rosemarie, and Marcy are key contributors to that activism and that work. And so can we start off to hear from one or two of you? Can you talk a little bit about the Worthy Wage campaign? What it is, how did it start? What were you working on and what were you trying to address? So can we have you all start and talk a little bit about the Worthy Wage movement?
I'll jump in if that's all right and just kind of get us started, because the first thing I think is the Worthy Wage campaign was an effort of the 1990s. But in fact, the decade and a half before that was laying the foundation for the Worthy Wage campaign. And equally, probably more important to the history of this movement. So I think the origins of the movement came from people's very personal experiences. I can say for myself that in 1976, when I graduated, my very first job in my chosen career, I knew it didn't pay well, but I was not prepared for how disrespected I was on the job, how unsupported I was on the job, how few resources I had to do what I was expected to do. And it honestly took me every bit of my courage, and plus a little encouragement from my friends, to kind of find my voice to stand up to somebody and quit my job. And it was my first job, right? I was really proud of having a first job. So there's that experience of that very personal experience that I did it and I felt empowered after it. My second job, I think, was reflected. An origin of the campaign is just in the times. I mean, when we think of the late 70s, I was coming of age in the late 60s and early 70s. And it was a time when young people especially thought they could change the world. And so my second job, I was with people who were smart and well-educated and we figured out that the way we changed the world was one child at a time, right? We were going to create a community that was non-sexist, non-racist, non-violent, and it was going to be kind and caring, and it was going to be everything that we wanted for kids. And soon found out that our struggle to survive was impeding on that vision of what we had to keep ourselves going. And so we started out as a group of friends, and as people did in that day, we found like-minded people. And so we soon were a group of friends who then became a support group, who then became some planners and some visionaries, I guess you would say, and ultimately in the late 70s became the Madison Area Child Care Workers United. That was our name. And we found out that there were other groups that were doing similar things that we were doing, but what really happened is that we began at that point to lay the foundation for the Worthy Wage campaign that came in the 1990s, right? So that decade and a half in between was a decade of great learning.
My first teaching job was in Illinois and at a small community childcare program. And yeah, we were paid pretty poorly and had some really challenging circumstances. And so when we went to the board and tried to talk to them about it, we were shut down immediately, quickly and immediately, telling us that we must have forgotten that we were actually missionaries, that the pay we were getting was what we should be getting. And so there was no place to go. The reason I share that is like, now what do we do? There's nothing we can do. And so later on, a few years later, when I started working at Head Start and a couple other places and saw the same situation going on, finally, at an NAYC conference, actually met with some of the folks Peggy's talking about from other states who were actually talking about compensation and were doing things in their communities to try to take that on. And so that's how I came in, and how the folks in North Carolina came in to be part of this larger conversation in multiple communities around the state. It was still before an organized Worthy Wage campaign. But then we began to learn from each other together when we could. And so that was really the root, was teachers finding each other and then finding their voices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I know you said two of us, but I'll just make a quick comment. So I was in, my first teaching job was with infants and toddlers in Berkeley. And it was like in a parent co-op because there was no infant toddler care that people could really find. And I did that for several years until those kids were 4, from the time they were 1 to 4. And then when I sort of got done, I was like, why is the child, I was making zilch money and I had like very little support. And so I decided, well, I want to know how childcare turned out like this. What's wrong with it? Because like Peggy, I was part of the movements of the 60s and the early 70s. And so I decided to do a little investigation of history. And it turned out that I called a meeting and said, does anybody want to come and hear about history? And out of that history meeting that we did, we went on to collect data about San Francisco childcare workers. I mean, we did all sorts of different things, and that we created what became the Child Care Employee Project. But I think for me, that period was really recognizing that in working with young children, nobody told us what to expect in terms of our jobs. That's what all of us shared. Like, we were just appalled at our low wages, the lack of respect. And we also were never taught by anybody who was training people, or any place that said, oh, you should expect this when you go get a job in childcare. You're going to be paid. You're not going to be respected. You're not going to be paid very much. And also that that we weren't told what we could do to do anything about that. And that's really how the California version of the compensation movement got kind of launched. Was we started connecting with other people, and like Peggy and Rosemarie and other people in California, to say, we all should know more about our history. And we did do it. We made a video, and that circulated amongst all groups in different communities around the country. And also, which is on our website too, you can see it now if you want to see it. And we also did a beyond just working with children sort of curriculum, where we sort of started to talk to each other about how we could learn to be advocates and start to do more about what to expect, and let other teachers know what to expect, and that we could do something about it. And that that was sort of how that led eventually to all of us getting together and leading to the Worthy Wage campaign. But it was really in various communities around the country, people were talking about these things. We found each other like at an NYC conference, and we found each other through like articles that got written and circulated. We somehow we discovered each other. And I think that there was just this sense of like, oh, we're not alone. We're not the only people in the country who think this system is underfunded. It exploits people, it doesn't value people, and it doesn't allow us to do what we want to do with children and families. And I think that experience was just, not every community did it the same way. Madison was different than Berkeley and San Francisco, but that didn't really matter. We all shared this idea that we had to do something to change the way people saw childcare workers, saw childcare, and funded it. And that's what it took us 15 years to get to the Worthy Wage campaign. But that's, what sort of set us off as coming together and trying to respect our different strategies to move things forward.
I kind of think it's interesting that what the three of us have done the last couple of years is like exploring the history of that time and realizing that when we started, we had to explore the history of the time before. So, I remember taking the slideshow that San Francisco did and showing it to programs here in Madison, Wisconsin. And people were like, wow, we didn't know that. Really, it was like an eye-opener. So when we do this work now of trying to, unveil our history again, we anticipate that maybe there'll be people who say, wow, I didn't even know that happened, So I think that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And Peggy, I think what you said is a good segue to kind of dig a little bit into what you were saying, kind of understanding history and unveiling history. The three of you have worked on an amazing project called Early Childhood History, Organizing, Ethos, and Strategy, which is short or long for ECHOS, right? So when we're saying ECHOS, we're referring to that. So can you talk a little bit about how did the Worthy Wage movement kind of lead up to where we are with ECHOS, and how do you see it being contributing to ECE and the change that we need to see?
With ECHOS, one of the things I realized, and I think we all came to realize as we continued to work on early childhood, was that there were many people who were coming into the field and they didn't really know what had come before. And that, particularly around the mentor-teacher program, but the Worthy Wage campaign and things that happened in the compensation movement in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that a lot of people who are involved now in trying to fix the system didn't really know that we had been working on these things for a long time, and there was sort of like just a lack of awareness of the history. And we had done a lot of work on that history and realizing that the inadequate funding, the disrespect for everybody who did the work, but particular discrimination against people in certain kinds of programs, and for particularly women of color, and the sort of, just like the lack of the things that have been going on since way back to the really late 19th century. Every decade, there had been people trying to fix the system in some ways, because I realized the underfunding was really hard. It was impossible for parents to get the services they needed. It was impossible for people to get the jobs that they needed. And that it was like, there was just a sense of like, oh, these things repeat. And that people step up and they try to push things forward and they make some advances. But so much of what happens in trying to improve early childhood policy it's situated in the politics that are going on in the country. So what people are able to do has something to do with what's happening in their state, what's happening in the society at large, during that time. And you can see that right now. And you can see that in the Worthy Wage campaign era. And you can see it in the decades before that. So I think understanding that even if you make some strides forward, you don't always hold on to those strides or make the strides you really wanted to make, because so much of this is situated into the way we think about women, the way we think about people of color, the way we think about children, and the way we think about the people who do this work. And so I think for us, realizing that, understanding that history and how some of these things play out in different eras was really important for understanding our own experience where we were making progress. We definitely did a lot on, sort of shattering this idea that working with young children and compensation shouldn't be talked about. But that doesn't mean we're going to gain what we need in every era. And so I think, that was kind of how it came about. Like, we had that experience. We want other people to know that, so that they can feel proud of the people who came before them that fought to make it better, and also understand the barriers that people faced in different generations that are, relevant, particularly because what happened in different states was not always the same. What Wisconsin did or North Carolina did was different than what happened in California. And California could be a leader for a while and then go way, way, way back, slide back. So I think that was part of our idea, that this history motivated all of us and kept us going, and maybe it would help other people in the field now.
I, for a lot of years, taught students at the university, and that's where it became extremely important to me to know the history and be able to talk about the history with students. And because they would show up sort of as if it was just, they were sort of this silo and not particularly connected to people in the past or even currently. And so when they viewed what was going on in early childhood, they looked at it as, if I work here, it's like this. If I work here, it's different. This is a little better. This isn't so good. But they didn't have an idea that work had gone on before them, and that they sort of had ancestors in early childhood that were activists and that were challenging things and actually putting forth solutions, working for them, not always winning, but they had no sense of that. And so I wish then we had Ethos to really help teach the students about that. And in fact, that's one of the things we're hoping with this, is that current professors and teachers can start weaving it into programs, so they do have a sense of the past that then can support what they might try to do going forward.
I think that's so incredibly impactful, Marcy and Rosemarie, what you're sharing. And for me, through my journey in ECE, starting out as a preschool teacher and working in that silo, right? Experiencing the inequities or the symptoms of the system, but not really knowing how to name them, and feeling alone in that. And for me, when I found out about the worthy wage movement, it was too late. I had already left the classroom, right? Because I was so burned out. I was so stressed out, and didn't feel empowered to do anything about it. And I reflect on, I wonder what Ethos and the worthy wage movement would have meant for me when I was in the classroom doing the work, and knowing that I had these ancestors, knowing that there was a rich history of activism, that I could do something. And so, that's kind of my experience. And Anna, I'm wondering, from your perspective, what's coming up for you as you're hearing about the worthy wage movement, and, what's your relationship with it? Did you know about it? Or were you like me, and did not? I'm curious about what's coming up for you.
Very similar. So much as what has been said just resonates. I think even Peggy's story, I was just sitting here like, wow, she's just naming exactly what I went through. And so I think for me, it was, I wouldn't say too little too late, or, at a stage where I'd left the classroom that I'd heard of it. But for me, the worthy wage movement and my connection to it was really because I've been a lifelong activist. Like, I'm somebody who always seeks out information and learning, and has been exposed to intergenerational knowledge and conversation. So I'm hungry for it in a way, and there's a curiosity there that I go out and seek out that knowledge myself. But what I found really difficult was bringing it back then to the classroom or to my fellow educators, and trying to rally the troops, so to speak, because it's really scary to be that vulnerable, either A, about your salary and compensation, about your level of education and what that means, because there is such a strong emphasis on, I was fortunate to have a bachelor's degree, and many of my colleagues did not. And so there were so many levels of conversation to be had that couldn't take place in the workplace, that we didn't feel safe to bring up in the workplace. So for me, where it really escalated or took on a new life is, as many have already said, was aligning with like-minded people, was finding those people through trainings or councils or other things that I was engaged with. So honestly, a lot of my story was, or evolved and really, was amplified by the conversations and the meaningful relationships that I built outside of the classroom. And so for me, I try and grapple with, now that I'm supporting the workforce outside of the classroom, what does it mean in their context? What does this look like to have this information? And as you said, Ashley, to have it before they even enter their classroom. As was also mentioned, is we often find ourselves after studying theory or taking the child development coursework, entering the field, and we hear this all the time, like, you learn so much on the job, and the practice itself can be overwhelming and surprise you in so many ways, both good and bad. And to not feel valued or even respected, let alone compensated, can be very discouraging very early on in the field. And those that are able to stick it out, I think how beautiful and rewarding it would be to be able to have that context and that history, as everyone has said, in the moment of teaching. How do we reach them? And I think of even through the California Early Child Mentor Program, as was mentioned, and I think also through what we've heard from educators just at Early Care Educators of San Francisco is, I never took a policy class. I never learned ECE policy. I don't even know, what's been done in the past and where we are now and why we're here today. So I think there's not only a need, but a curiosity and interest in it. And where would it put us today, if our teachers had that and knew that they weren't alone, or knew that these questions and demands that they have aren't unreasonable or, unheard of, I would say. So that's a little bit about just my experience and how I came to this work. But unfortunately, it was when stepping out of the classroom that I was able to commit more and do more.
I think I just want to add that I hear this thing about learning, and I think people don't realize how much we had to learn to do this campaign. I mean, we didn't know anything about policy. We didn't know anything about doing surveys, and yet we did surveys. We didn't know. I mean, we taught ourselves so much. We taught ourselves what unions were, how to unionize. We taught ourselves things like how to deal with the media. I mean, it was an explosive time of learning. And sometimes what I think is, I have to remind myself that in some ways the job was different in the 1980s than it is in the 2000s.
Yeah.
There are many more demands on the workforce now than there were then. I felt like we had some space and some time to actually do a lot of learning. And in some ways, that's what kept me connected to the job and not leaving the job, because it was so dynamic and I was learning so many other things. And I worry now about the workforce today and the demands that they have on their jobs that take some of that freedom and some of that space and time of learning away.
I was going to say, I would agree with that, because there was so much learning going on. And I think in the beginning years of the compensation movement, we were trying to reach other people who were doing the work. And but then we realized when we got to the Worthy Wage campaign, we realized that we had to reach outside. The field was changing and there were more people doing different roles. And if we wanted to do policy, we'd have to talk to other people. But a lot of the mainstream organizations were very hostile to us because we were seen as, rebel rousers or whatever it was. We were trying to use the sort of the tools of the field in reaching out to other teachers and engaging people in the compensation movement and eventually into the Worthy Wage campaign. So we wrote songs and we have poems. They're all on the website. You can listen to them that we did. We tried to use the sort of things we knew from working with children into what we did in our policy and our work. So like we would have, like in California, we had a big Play-Doh campaign outside of the Capitol, and we, walking around saying we want real dough, not Play-Doh, and but that's how we got attention. And we did a couple of, studies that got national attention. But we also just tried to do things that were fun for people in the field. So we had a Rights, Racism, Respect t-shirt. And the first thing that the Berkeley people ever created was a button that said, give a childcare worker a break, because we didn't get breaks, and we wanted to sort of let people know that we were sort of calling on our own experience and stuff. And I think that we had different songs and different things. And so I think that was one of the ways we reached out to people. And when we moved from just working on the compensation movement to the Worthy Wage campaign, that came after many years working through a caucus in NAYC. trying to, get people to realize what was going on. And so groups started, popping up all around the country, often made of teachers. And so I think, that was our focus, was how do we get teachers to feel like they can learn the stuff, they can do this stuff, or know about it. But we also realized that people had very different attitudes about policy and political work. And so we had a lot of things we had to learn about how to work with a broader group of people who would be involved. But I do think we succeeded in getting many people in the field, or many people doing the work, to talk about that we weren't treated well, and that not treating the people who do the work well made it very difficult to do what we wanted to do for children and families. We were often accused as not caring about only about money and not children and families, which this wasn't true. But we got accused of things because we were going up against the more established leadership. But we drew in a lot of teachers and providers because we were playful, we were creative, we were experimental, and that was part of how we did organizing in that era, a different era. But that was part of how we built out the movement, which eventually led to the Worthy Wage campaign.
Just a footnote to that is there was internal work that we had to do,
Yes.
and that teachers had to do. And part of that is what Marcy raised, is we were being accused of a lot of things, like not caring about children. And so that's pretty rough on a teacher to have that accusation come at you. And the other sort of part was not being able to see themselves as leaders, not understanding that the tools they used with children were leadership skills. And so there were sort of many levels at which this learning was happening and change was happening.
And don't you think we had to also learn about the discrimination within the field and the differences between different roles? I mean, there was a lot of internal, what was it like to be a family child care provider versus being a center-based teacher? There's just a lot of work that we had to do and struggle with people who had a degree and people who didn't have a degree. And if we were going to raise salaries, did that mean that the people who had more education should get more money and that everybody shouldn't get, their salaries raised? So there were those kind of internal issues that we had to work through. So all the learning was going on was not just, oh, this is because I think I learned this, I know this now. A lot of it was painful because we had to face differences among us and poor treatment that some people had, and also disagreements about certain things among people who are working with children, let alone people who were, running big organizations who might say, oh yeah, better compensation is good, but we don't have the money for it, so we don't want to talk about it, that kind of thing. So it was a learning and growing time, and I think all of us had to really rethink some of the assumptions we had. Not assumptions about should people be paid more, should we fund the childcare system differently than we do, that the United States has it wrong. That never changed, I don't think, for any of us. But some of our strategies to move forward, we had to struggle with internally with a lot of it, and we ran out of money too, which was another part of our efforts to, move forward.
So hearing you all, just reflect on some of the successes and challenges, of the Worthy Wage movement, and how the work of Ethos is really meant to document that history, to make it available, is incredibly inspiring and instructive for me in my work at Jumpstart, where we're working tirelessly to create pathways and pipelines for our future workforce, and knowing how important understanding the history of the ECE system and teacher activism to help our future teachers understand that they are change agents, that they do have power, that their voices are important in systems change. So I just thank you for that. I feel inspired, and what I'm hearing from you is instructive. And I'm curious, from your perspective, just reflecting on the successes and challenges of the Worthy Wage movement, what's coming up for you? Are you feeling inspired, discouraged? What's coming up for you in your perspective?
Yeah, I think I always say, while it's discouraging to hear and relate so much to things happening so long ago, I think it's also reassuring to have the tools and the resources that Ethos gives us, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel here, that, to Marcy's point, they have been experimental and creative in ways that can inspire us to do so in today's day and age. And I think there's all kinds of tools and mechanisms, TikTok being one of them, that even I feel aged out of. But I think it's just a testament to how to approach people and how to engage people in different and playful ways. I think when Marcy was speaking, what came up for me was just bringing joy and inspiring joy in this work too, that while it can be so hard and discouraging at times and overwhelming and exhausting, that really honing in on something we are passionate about. And I think all of us described having just an internal fire for these things, that we don't dim that light, that we actually lean into it and explore kind of what is our path to influence or to engage in this field, because we don't all have to do it the same way. I think that's something I learned a little later on that I would have liked to. So I'm just feeling so inspired to hear in the many ways that they, develop these tools and pulled from other resources and learned, just learning, ongoing learning. So that's really what I'm taking away today, that I'm a lifelong learner, and hearing that is just as reassuring today as it was years ago for me.
Yes. And so I wish we had so much time to just continue this conversation. The good thing is there will be some time on June 8th when we have a live Q&A where we can dive a bit deeper. But to kind of close this out, I think it's interesting when we think about Ethos as a resource and a tool that helps us understand history in a moment in our country where people are fighting hard to bury history and not give access. So I think the work is even more critical, especially as we know that ECE is not a space that is divorced from inequity. We know that ECE is rife with inequities for our workforce, for our children, for our families, and we have to be talking about issues of economic, racial, gender justice as well, right? And so as we are in the face of inequity and oppression, we also know that people have always resisted. People have always fought. We have 3 of them right here in front of us who have talked about their histories, and 2 folks right here between Anna and I who are actively doing that in our daily work as well, fighting for the system that we need to see. But as we close out, I'm curious to hear from Marcy, Rosemarie, and Peggy. You were organizers of the Worthy Wage movement, and you amplified a critical message to secure rights and ensure dignity for educators, children, and families in ECE. And as Anna has said, we find ourselves in that same fight today. We've made some progress, but we have a ways to go, right? And so when you, Rosemarie, Peggy, Marcy, when you look into the future, 20 years, what do you see? And what are some of the biggest opportunities that we can build on in ECE today? And what are maybe some of the challenges that we need to brace ourselves for and be thinking about? And what can we be doing right now to accelerate the change that we need to see? So there's a few questions in that question, but when you kind of think ahead 20 years, what is it that you want to say to us and everyone watching, where we have opportunities, we might have some pitfalls that we need to be aware of? What are some things on your mind that you would like to share?
It's kind of hard for us to think 20 years hence, but nonetheless, I would say that, I think we're aware of different ways and we were discouraged, and that we can get somewhat disheartened by it. I think for us, working on Ethos was a way for us to continue our lifelong commitment to this. So all of us have been at this for 40 years, and we're not stopping even if our roles are changing. And I think, we realize going forward, people who are working on this have to realize this is not going to be over in, like a nanosecond, that there's going to have to be ongoing work. But I guess I would just want to say that one of the things that keeps me going and inspires me is Anna and Ashley and all the people now who are trying to work on this. I know that's really hard. We don't have it, but it gives me hope that there's a next generation of people who are going to figure out a way to go forward. It won't be the way we did it, and that's okay, but they will be, people will try. And I think that makes me feel like, okay, our message wasn't wrong. Other people embrace it, and we didn't waste our life doing this, even though we didn't succeed at getting all of what we wanted. And part of that is because of the politics of our country, which are just where they are right now. So I would say thank you to both of you and all of you who are working on this in this generation, because it gives me a sense of like, I can breathe, like, in 20 years, if I'm still around and I'm not doing anything, I'm not working at all, I'll sort of feel like there's a whole group of people behind us that are doing that. So I just have tremendous gratitude, and just the caution that it's not going to be a slam dunk. And, it's highly political, alas, but there are many people in the country who are trying to deal with where we are, and hopefully we won't be here forever.
I would, one of the things, I would echo everything that Marcy just said, first of all, but I always think that a constant through all of our time, the time before us, and the time that's in the next 20 years, is that people who are passionate about children stay passionate about children. There is something about the work we do and the people who do it that I just love. And I've always said, I think childcare people are some of the finest people in the whole world. And so find your people, find the people who are like you. And I think if people continue to have a passion for making things right for children and families, and they have a passion for I don't know, for the work, that I think that this work will go on. I have confidence that the work's going to go on, and like Marcy said, it will look different. But the worst thing that could happen, and the worst thing that does happen, is when people lose heart for their job. And you got to bring a lot of heart to this job. And so we have to help each other do that in order to find those new ways of organizing ourselves, of politicizing, our work, and of creating the changes that we want to make. So we have to kind of keep the heart and help each other find it. Keep sharing our stories. I mean, I think that's that's what history is, right? Is sharing the stories. So we have to encourage people to keep sharing their stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think you all are examples of people who are trying to keep that door open for our early childhood educators, because that's the hard part, I think, is people don't have the experience, the competence, the support to be in places where decisions are made unless they have folks like you there to help with that, to support it, to give people the tools that they need. Because if we don't have teachers at the table, as we used to say, it's likely that we'll keep spinning. So I'm glad that you all are there to keep those doors open.
Well, we thank you all. And, I think a continued thread throughout this conversation is in our work toward a just ECE system. We have to center the voices, the knowledge, the experience, the expertise, the perspectives of our early educators. Off mute and amplified, right? The voices need to be amplified. If there's anyone in our system who is thinking about solutions for children, families, and their counterparts, it's educators themselves. So having them at the table, having them off mute and amplified, right, is so critical for us to work toward that system that we want to see. And I always say, and will never not say, that we will never have an equitable ECE system, let alone a just ECE system, if our workforce continues to experience inequities. It's impossible, right? And so this work, we thank you for this work. We thank you for the gift and how Echoes is instructive for us to connect to that history, that rich history of activism that we have connection to really uplift and put in front of other educators and systems leaders and policy folks, instructors, everyone out there to really help to shift that discourse a little bit, to really center it around the empowerment of educators. So I thank each of you, those of you who are watching. We hope that you join us for our live Q&A on June 8th. That hyperlink will be coming up in a version of a QR code shortly, so you can join us and register. And we look forward to having you, and we look forward to our continued collaboration in this work toward a better ECE system. Thanks, everyone.